In this video, I am going to give a brief outline of the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant represents the culmination of Enlightenment, we all know, and Kant is a very significant philosopher in the sense that he represents the classical traditional modern philosophy. But if we are to enter into the intellectual pathways of 20th century Western philosophy, either it is analytical tradition or it is continental tradition, especially contemporary continental tradition, it is important that we are going through Kant. So, understanding the fundamentals of Kantian philosophy is very significant, and in other terms I can say reading Kant or rereading Kant is very important for anyone who does contemporary Western tradition. Now there are three important roads to Kant. The philosophical context of Kant is very significant in the sense that Kant had to bring under one umbrella the questions relating to modern science, religion, morality and what not. In other words, Kant was standing in an intellectual junction, we can say, where many pathways or many roads were coming to a point. Now, what are the three important roads to Kant? One is from Descartes to Kant, that is the influence of rationalism. Second one is from Locke to Kant, that is the influence of empiricism. Another one can be Rousseau to Kant. So these are the three important roads to Kant. So Kant had to comprehend all these three significant philosophers and their contributions in his philosophy. Kant also writes three critiques. We know Kant is a critical philosopher. Kant himself says that he is a critical philosopher. The first critique is the critique of pure reason. The second one is the critique of practical reason, and the third one is the critique of judgment. Now we can't say which one is more important or which one is less important. In fact, all the three critiques are magnanimous, or we can say they are all magnum opuses in philosophy. What is the task of modern Western philosophers? We have an array of philosophers beginning from Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley and Hume. They were all trying to reconcile science and religion in their philosophical engagements. Kant was also not an exception to this. So Kant, through his three critiques, was trying to bring together scientific reason, morality and religious belief, working together consistently or mutually, we can say. The important question here is, does Kantian conceptions give a notion of divided self? How the three critics address the issue? This is the important topic, important subject matter that I am trying to address in this particular video. So what I intend to do is try to give a very brief outline of the three critics, in the sense that how Kant is trying to address the question of the notion of a divided self. But before that, the very important question is, is the self divided, or is it because of a misreading of Kant? What is the fundamental thesis of Kantian philosophy? Kantian philosophy is centered on human autonomy. Human understanding structure all our experiences. Whenever we read Kant, the very important thing that comes to our mind is there are certain universal elements which are present in all human persons. Whether it be the question relating to knowledge, as we see in Critique of Pure Reason, or morality, as we see in Critique of Practical Reason, or the question relating to beauty or taste, as we see in the Critique of Judgment, there are certain universal elements which are present in every human being. Kant represents the culmination of enlightenment, we know. So, the very important task of Kant was to address reason, God, freedom, the question of immortality, everything under one single umbrella. But if we read from another angle, it's obvious that in all the three critiques, Kant was trying to answer one and a single question: how does reason work? Because whenever we read Kant, we come across terms like pure reason, practical reason, ideas of reason, terms like this. Now let us see one by one what Kant means by all these different concepts. One of the earliest works of Kant was the inaugural dissertation. Now in that work, Kant wrote, sensibility and understanding are two distinct powers of cognition. Now, but what is understanding? It includes the whole intelligible world. It is something like Platonism. The understanding grasps the paradigm of nominal perfection also. This is the position of Kant in his inaugural dissertation. But Kant after that wrote the magnum opus, Critique of Pure Reason. So where Kant denied his earlier view. So in Pure Reason, Kant very clearly and succinctly states that ideas of reason should be separated from concepts of understanding. The relation of reason is to empirical truth. In fact, that led to a lot of positive aspects of reason. That is why he named his magnum opus as Critique of Reason, because it understands the possibilities of reason, but at the same time understands the limit of reason also. And maybe that is the very important contribution of Kant. Only once there is judgment can there be error, says Kant. This explains the limit of reason, because where is judgment possible? Judgment is possible only when we relate it to the empirical truths. But when reason tries to comprehend things which are beyond our empirical experience, no judgment is possible. So if no judgment is possible, we cannot determine whether the statements are true or false. Therefore, Kant says we have to understand the limits of reason. The law of reason is seeking the unity with sensibility. It is necessary. Why? Otherwise, no empirical truth is possible. So, here we can see Kant taking the good elements from both the rationalism as well as empiricism. But we know Kantian conception of rationalism is not the exact replica of the continental rationalism, nor is his empiricism the exact replica of the British empiricism. There are certain differences. Now let me try to explain these things in the coming slides. What is the possibility of metaphysics in Kant? That's the next important question. Sensibility and understanding supplies forms that structure our experience of the world. Now, human reason and knowledge is limited. Therefore, in order to answer the question, what is the position of metaphysics in Kant? The better answer can be, metaphysics is held in suspension in Kant. There is metaphysics, but this Kantian notion of metaphysics is different from the earlier notions, or rather I shall say the metaphysics and the notion of metaphysics in the predecessors of Kant. Noumena is unknown. So before that, let me briefly explain the Kantian division between phenomena and noumena. Kant says there is the phenomenal world, this empirical world. So there sensibility is possible, understanding is possible, where knowledge is possible, that is the phenomena. But there are things which are beyond our empirical experience. We can never deny them. They do exist. For example, the question of God. God exists, but not within the limits of phenomena. So another aspect of the world is noumena or the noumenal world. But noumena is unknown, because no sensibility is possible, or sense experience is not possible in the realm of noumena. Sense experience is possible only within the realm of phenomena. Another important aspect of Kant, or when we address the issue of reason, a very interesting thing about reason in the philosophy of Kant is the very self-reflexive nature of reason. That is, reason acts as its own judge. There is the betrayal of reason, says Kant. Why? Because maybe the philosophers who came before Kant, they believed that reason can know anything and everything. They tried to know or comprehend with reason everything, including noumena. But what will happen if we try to know things beyond, which are beyond our empirical purview, which are in fact beyond the limits of reason? Maybe we fall into illusions or errors. That is the very significant contribution of Kant. Here, Kant is making a very important statement. I have to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. I have to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Why? Because we know, as I have stated at the outset of my presentation, Kant is a philosopher who just wanted to reconcile between science and religion. He wanted to see that science gets its importance. At the same time, he also wanted to see that religion is also very safe in its position. So both reason and faith, both are getting its due. That is the main task of Kant. Coming to the Enlightenment and the Critique of Pure Reason, because Kant is writing this Critique of Pure Reason, his masterpiece, we can say, where he represents the culmination of enlightenment. What is the watchword of enlightenment, slogan of enlightenment period? Sapere aude, man, dare to use your reason. Progress is during the enlightenment period. Progress was measured in terms of reason, but doubt regarding the outcome of reason was there here and there, that came here and there. And many, including Kant, feared whether reason may replace the traditional authorities. to make it more clear, whether reason may overturn the moral and religious beliefs, whether the Enlightenment, with its authority on reason, may lead man to such a state of affairs. So that was the big question that remained before Kant. Mechanical laws of nature guarded freedom. It threatened moral or religious beliefs. But another important question arises here. What is the place of freedom in Kant? Because we often say that Kant is a champion of freedom. But what is the place of freedom in Kant? The intellectual crisis of Enlightenment, or we can say Critique of Pure Reason, was in fact a response to the above crisis of Enlightenment. In the next slide, what comes is how Critique of Pure Reason unites science with reason, morality and religion. Sensible world is founded upon certain a priori truths. We know the distinction between a priori and a posteriori. A priori means prior to experience, and a posteriori means that which is possible through experience, post or because of experience, we can say. And here comes the Copernican revolution of Kant. Just like what Copernicus has done in the field of science, Kant is taking the position of Copernicus in the field of philosophy. And what is that Copernican revolution? Philosophers who came before Kant believed that we understand or we know the world as it is. But Kant said, understanding maketh nature. That is, it is our understanding that makes nature. So he just reversed the opinion of his predecessors. That is why we say that Kant has done a Copernican revolution in philosophers. Kant observes that modern science is founded upon certain a priori truths, but there is no a priori knowledge of phenomena. That is, a transcendent metaphysics is impossible. That is why we can say in Kantian philosophy, Kant never tries to prove the existence of God through any rational arguments. No. Why? Because reason is limited there. So no transcendent metaphysics is possible. What is the limit of, or what is the realm of science? It is the realm of phenomena. But what is the realm of religion or morality? It is a different realm. That is the realm of noumena. Here, Kant brings in the postulates of morality when he explains the metaphysics of morals. Now, Kant is in fact giving an one world interpretation, because when we say phenomena, noumena like that, does it amount to something like a two world interpretation? No, never. They are simply two aspects of one and the same world. So there is only one world. He says, I had to establish limits to knowledge in order to make room for faith. In fact, Kantian position is a kind of a transcendental idealism. What is transcendental in Kant? When Kant uses the term transcendental, he simply means conditions of knowledge. There are certain conditions of knowledge. They are a priori. For example, Kant says, in order that we have sensory knowledge, we need to have the preconditions or the a priori truths of space and time. They are the intuitive forms of mind. In order that understanding is possible, we need to have the 12 categories. They are the a priori forms of understanding. And if we simply have sensibility and understanding, knowledge is not possible. But they are to be synthesized. There should be a unity of experience, and that is possible because of consciousness. So that unity of a perception is to be effected. So the importance of self, existence of self, comes in the realm of knowledge also. Not only when Kant deals with the question of morality, but while discussing about knowledge also, the place of self can never be undermined. So space and time are not things in themselves. So that is very important. See, space and time, categories, these are all certain a priori forms for getting knowledge, but they are not things in themselves. So Kantian position, we can say, is a two worlds interpretation, phenomena and noumena, but not two objects interpretation, rather two aspects interpretation. One world interpretation where there are two aspects, that which does not appear and that which appears. Why? Because there is a very famous statement of Kant: in order that knowledge is possible, we need to have both percepts as well as concepts. So if no percepts are there, no sensibility is there, no appearances are there, knowledge is not possible. So that is why he says there is the one world interpretation where we can see two aspects, that does not appear and that which appears. Now this brings us to the question of, very important question of self-consciousness. What is the source of our sense of an invariable self that persists our experience? It's a pointer towards another philosophical question, the question of personal identity. What about my personal identity? Who am I? So that question arises here. So we can think about that question of personal identity also when we refer to Kant. But when we think of personal identity, the philosopher who comes to our mind is John Locke, because we know John Locke has already discussed about the question of personal identity. Now some representational content is always present in my experience. So that is why I have an identity of my own. That is what John Locke says. But Kantian position regarding personal identity is somewhat different, where Kant says, I quote, "It is not my accompanying each representation with consciousness, but my adding of one's representation to the other and being conscious of their synthesis," unquote. So this is a kind of a formal conception of consciousness. So Kantian concept of consciousness is very, very formal, we can say. Here I would like to add that why Kant is important to an analytical thinker and why Kant is important to a continental thinker. It is as regards the ways in which they read Kant. Analytical philosophers, they could see that critique of reason is the important contribution of Kant. So philosophers, analytical philosophers, especially Wittgenstein, he simply extended the critique of reason to the critique of language. That is why maybe we can say Wittgenstein said all philosophy is critique of language, because Wittgenstein could also see the limits of language. Whereas the continental philosophers, especially the phenomenologists, existentialists, etc., they took the concept of consciousness in Kant and they tried to develop that idea, and that is why we have continental tradition, and that speaks about the importance of Kant as a philosopher. Now, Kantian consciousness, I continue, is the idealist version of consciousness. Here we can take two positions. What is the realist version of consciousness? According to the realist position, we become self-conscious by attending to the law-governed regularities of nature. So, in realism, we know the external world or the nature exists independent of the human mind. Whereas, in idealism, everything is mind dependent. So, in the idealist version of consciousness, awareness of mind's law-governed activity to construct a unified experience is made possible. So, it is necessary for self-consciousness that we exercise an a priori capacity to represent the world as law-governed. So, these are the two different versions of self-consciousness, not consciousness but self-consciousness. The realist position of self-consciousness and the idealist position of self-consciousness. So, in Kant, self is a notion of necessity and universality. It is a priori. Now, we know in order that knowledge is possible, percepts are there, categories are there, understanding is there, or concepts are there. But if percepts simply remain percept and concepts simply remain concept, is it so that knowledge is possible? No. Knowledge is not possible, but it has to be unified in a single experience, isn't it? So, here comes the importance of synthetic unity of apperception. Now, what is apperception? Apperception is not perception. Apperception, to put it in the most simple terms, we can say, is a feeling that it is mine, the experience is mine, because it is happening to the one and the same person. I am having that experience of perception, I am having that or sensibility, I shall say. I am having that experience of understanding, and these are synthesized or they are united, and knowledge is possible for me, the knowledge is mine. That is what is called a very beautiful concept of synthetic unity of perception in Kant. Now, I think must be able to represent all my representations. So, this particular statement may lead us to think about another question. Is Kantian position is representing subjectivity or objectivity? What is the position of Kant? So, that is the next important issue that we have to address. Here, there may arise a doubt as if different cells, different persons are trying to know the world, understand the world, or interpret the world. So, is it something like space-time 1, space-time 2 or space-time 3? Is it so? That means, are there different worlds, or is there a single objective world? That's the question. So, understanding and sensibility, or sensibility together with understanding, are to construct one unified space-time to which all representations are related in self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is possible in a single objective world. Otherwise, there may be a disjoint experience like space-time 1, space-time 2 or space-time 3, like that. But there is no such disjoint experience which amounts to saying that there is a single objective world. So, our categories are the sources of laws of nature. So, where is the self? True self is outside time, because we know Kant's position or the context of self in Kantian philosophy. It is not exhausted simply in the theory of knowledge, but very important when we come to the next magnum opus, that is practical reason, because it is one of the fundamental postulates of morality. So, Kant here says true self is outside of time. Continuing with the question of freedom, let me move on to the second magnum opus of Kant, that is the critique of practical reason. Is there freedom when we come to morality in Kant, or what is the place of freedom in Kantian conception of morality? The human person is subject to the demands of categorical imperatives. So, Kant says there is the moral law within, the moral will shines by its own light. So, Kant says that it is like a jewel, and these moral laws within, they come like imperatives or commands. And what type of commands? Categorical commands or categorical imperatives, that is unconditional commands. In fact, there are 3 in number. The first categorical imperative states that act only on that maxim which thou canst will to be universal. The second maxim says that treat everyone, including yourselves, always as a subject and never as an object, or always as an end and never as a means. Number 3, act as if you are a member of the kingdom of ends. So, these 3 maxims or principles of Kant, they are called the categorical imperatives. So, that means what Kant says is, in fact, Kant says in some of his works, 2 things have attracted me, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So, when he says the starry heavens above, he means how to know. So, that question of knowledge we have already seen. What can we know and what is the limit of knowledge we have seen. But what about the moral law within? So, that also attracted Kant. That is why he is turning to morality, we can say. That is why he is writing the second critique, we can say. But here, what is the role of reason? It is not pure reason, it is practical reason. That is reason applied to the practical context of human life. So, even when coming to ethics or morality, Kant cannot get rid of reason. So, Kantian morality is rational in its nature. So, subjection to morality implies we must be free, but whether Kantian morality allows freedom, that is an important question. So, there must be some guideline, says Kant, in morality that all can follow, mere form of law. So, when Kant says one has to follow the moral law like a command, the question naturally arises where there is freedom. So, in order to answer that or address that question, what is Kant saying? Kant says it is like a command, but that is, or that rule or that command is only simply like a guide or a rule. that is leading us forward. So we are moral agents, says Kant. So how freedom implies here is not subjecting to dictates of another person. So in that way, Kant is trying to justify the question of freedom. When a person is said to follow the dictates of reason, that dictates of reason or moral law, because moral will or moral law is rational, and it's a rational will or a rational moral law. I am not supposed to follow the dictates of another person, but this moral law, this rational will is coming from within only. But follow a fact of reason, moral law or moral will shines by its own light. Again, just like the a priori forms of knowledge, that is the preconditions of knowledge, space-time, categories, etc. There are certain universal elements when we come to the question of morality also, and that is the presence of a moral will or a rational will within us. So that moral consciousness is a practical certainty of freedom, says Kant. But there are criticisms whether Kantian morality allows freedom, because anyway there are the dictates of reason, or there are the commandments, like I can say, or the imperatives where I am bound to follow that. So maybe there is no total freedom even when we come to the Kantian question of morality also. So it leads to another important element in Kant. In one of the treatises, that is Critique of Pure Reason, Kant speaks about the theoretical aspect of reason, and in the next one, that is the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant speaks about the practical aspect of reason. Now, whether it is giving a kind of a notion of a divided self, or to how to unite between these theoretical and practical aspects of reason. The sphere that unites is assumption of God, says Kant. His creation of a teleological nature. Teleology means purpose or end. So teleological nature means nature is purposive. There is an end, or there is a purpose in nature, and there is the conception of the highest good in nature. Maybe here Kant is influenced by Leibniz, because Leibniz also says this world is the best of all possible worlds. So here also Kant says, what about this outside nature? It's very, very purposive. It is the creation of God, and this nature represents the highest good. So what about categorical imperative or morality? It's the supreme principle of reason. Why? Because there, in order to achieve wisdom or morality, one has to make use of one's reason. But still there is some kind of a moral constraint or some kind of a restriction. Then why is Kant a champion of freedom? Or in what way we can say that Kant is a champion of freedom? Where does he allow freedom to play its role? This leads us to the third critique of Kant, that is the critique of judgment. There are many who say that Kant has written the third critique, is the critique of judgment, in order to reconcile, or as I have said, unite the theoretical aspects of reason, as that we have seen in the case of the first critique, and the practical aspect of reason that we have, as we have seen in the case of the second critique. So the critique of judgment. So here he gives, so I am here giving just a summary of the main contest of Kant in his third judgment. So Maxims as percepts for reason as a whole. So here he tries to see a reason more in a holistic perspective. You can give three maxims here with reference to the third judgment. So I mean the third critic. Think for oneself without any prejudice. So why should I think? I shall think for myself. And maybe I can use the term with bracketing out all my prejudices. Number two, think into the place of the other. Accountability for the other. So the other comes into play here. That is very crucial, because when we come to post-structuralism, we know the other gets its importance. And when we look into the second categorical imperative of Kant, you can see Kant is saying, treat everyone, including yourself, always as a subject and never as an object. So the concern for the other, accountability for the other. So that is there. And that is an important maxim in critique of judgment. Third one is always think consistently within oneself. Now, with all this, how Kant addressed the question of enlightenment. So there is the very famous masterpiece of Kant, What is Enlightenment?, where Kant tries to define enlightenment. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Man, you use your reason. You be dare enough to use your reason. So, if you are not using your reason properly, you are immature, says Kant. So, that is how Kant tries to define the, enlightenment. So, critique of judgment, we can say, is a bridge between critique of pure reason and critique of practical reason. Now, I come to the very first question which I have put in the beginning of my lecture, how the question of autonomy, how it works in Kant. Because as we have seen in the case of critique of pure reason, understanding legislates a priori for nature. And what is happening in the case of critical practical reason? Reason legislates a priori for freedom. So, naturally, this brings as if a kind of a feeling that there is a divided self between our physical existence within the deterministic laws of nature. So, when in our physical existence in this world, we are determined by the laws of mechanical nature. So, where is freedom? There is no freedom in that sense. So, and what about our autonomous existence as moral agents? There also we can say we are moral agents obeying the moral laws of freedom. So, critique of judgment gives a single conception of world where nature is teleological, and in the critique of judgment we know Kant is giving importance to the third faculty of human being, that is the feeling, or here he takes the question of not truth or knowledge or goodness or morality, but beauty is the realm of art, taste, where he explains about sublime, beautiful, etc. So, one feels free at home, where? In nature. So, where can we find freedom in its true sense in Kant? Maybe in the critique of judgment. That may be one of the reasons why it is said that though Kant has written 3 critiques, The Critique of Judgment is perhaps the best magnum opus of Kant. Maybe there may be differences in opinion, because free play of cognitive faculties is being allowed in the realm of art. See, when we are doing with science, or we are determined by the causal laws of nature, maybe they are not allowing some kind of a free play of our cognitive faculties, but when we are in the realm of art, maybe we are very free, because what is significant about art, there we can use our creative faculties, creative imagination, skill, creative potentialities. So one feels totally at one's will, and one feels at home, to use the Kantian terminology, completely free, totally free, when one comes to the context of artistic creations or artistic enjoyments or artistic judgments. So judgment of taste is based on the free play of cognitive faculties. So here there is no nothing like a deterministic law of nature, or something like a categorical imperative making us to obey. Nothing is there. One feels free when one enjoys the beauty of nature. And there is the very famous disinterested conception of taste in Kant. Now, feature of the aesthetic judgments are universality and necessity. So, no definite rule or no imperatives can be imposed, we can say. No deterministic laws can be imposed in the realm of art, because artistic creation and talent or genius, there is no scientificality, there is no definite rule, or there is no deterministic law, but only originality. That is why there is freedom. So, in this short video, I have tried to give a very brief outline of the question, what is the main contention of Kant, and how he has tried to address these important questions through these great magnum opuses, that is Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of Judgment. It is very difficult to say something about Kant, especially within the stipulated time of 30 to 45 minutes, but I was just trying to touch upon some of the important issues relating to Kant, especially the place of freedom in Kant, and how this freedom makes its appearance in the three critiques. Thank you.